It all begins on the farm.
So what are you planting here?
These are green beans, and they're going to be going to Fresh Market or to a cannery.
Jenny Schmidt and her husband Hans are the third generation now farming this land on Maryland's eastern shore. They grow corn, soy, and grains for feed, vegetables for canning, and even grapes for winemaking.
And this was planted, what, just a couple of
months ago? This was planted May.
They choose to grow biotech or genetically modified corn and soy. Jenny is also a registered dietitian who writes a blog defending that decision. It's called The Foodie Farmer.
If it's substantially equivalent to what we know already that we consume in the food supply system, then it's safe. And the research has supported that. When you look at the approval from the regulatory agencies in the federal government, and you look at the approvals around the world of the number of countries who have approved it, whether they label it or not, it's been found to be safe.
And yet 20,000 stores in the U.S. cater to shoppers who only want to buy organic foods.
I really like this soup. It's organic. I can read through the ingredients. The first thing it's made of is chicken stock and dried onion, dried garlic, spices, green beans, vegetables, sea salt, no GMs. And as opposed to a lot of typical soup brands are loaded with salt, sugar, corn syrup, preservatives, unnatural flavorings to make it seem like you're buying chicken soup, but really it's a can of all these preservatives and additives with chicken flavoring. So that's what I find in the typical grocery stores. It's not a substantial food source, so I would avoid them.
Kim Groark is one of those shoppers. Despite the fact that the U.S. government has approved GMO ingredients for human consumption, she is committed to avoiding them.
I always look at the ingredients anyway, even if it's non-GMO. What I love about this is there's no soy, there's no corn, there's no cottonseed, there's no canola. So,
and those are the
and there's no sugar, correct. If it just says sugar as an ingredient, then you can pretty much venture to guess that it's going to have GMOs in it.
Kim is so dedicated that she's even willing to give up modern conveniences to offset the extra costs of buying organic.
You want to try that? We don't have a flat screen TV. That's on hold. We don't, we altered our cable schedule, cut down on phone costs, things like that. So we do budget a little extra for food, and we're happy with that.
3 out of 4 Americans say they're concerned about genetically modified organisms, according to a New York Times poll taken in January 2013. So what does it mean to be genetically modified? For an answer, we asked Nina Fedorov, a microbiologist who specializes in biotechnology, the science of altering plants through inserting new proteins into the plant's DNA. Plants are genetically modified to add nutrition or to prevent weeds, diseases, or pests.
When you say that there's a pesticide that's incorporated into the plant, that's true, but it's not the same as a chemical pesticide. It's a protein that is toxic for a certain kind of insect, a kind of insect that bores into corn plants, but for you and for animals in general, it's just another protein because you don't have what's called the receptor to which it binds.
Fedorov says genetically modifying plants in this way is a more precise method of achieving a goal that biologists have sought for centuries. Only the methods of the past were crossing and grafting species together in what she describes as a scattershot approach.
What we do now is we start with something that's good, that's a big ear, for example, for corn, has desirable traits for tomatoes, for example, and then you just modify a tiny bit. So what we do today is much, much less of a modification than anything we did in the past. It's safer, it's based on knowledge, and it's based on a very minimal disturbance of the genes.
The new plants are then tested for toxicity and allergens by the manufacturer. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration says the genetic hybrids are just as safe as the plants that Mother Nature makes, and are not more likely to cause an allergic or toxic reaction.
There is no evidence that it's more dangerous than techniques we used in the 20th century for genetic modification.
But there is disagreement in the medical and scientific communities. In fact, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine cites animal studies that link genetically modified foods with infertility, immune problems, and changes in major organs.
If you put a GM piece of corn in front of me and a natural piece of corn, I'm still going to opt for the natural piece of corn, no matter what study comes out and says it's been determined it doesn't cause cancer or autoimmune diseases or allergies or infertility or liver problems, spleen problems, gastrointestinal issues. So they could come up with that study and I still wouldn't consume it.
Because?
Because it's not natural.
There is global consensus that these foods are different. The World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, Codex Alimentarius, which is the food safety standards agency of the world, have determined that these foods are different and they should be required to undergo mandatory safety assessments.
Trudy Bialik, an anti-GMO advocate and natural foods marketer, says she's concerned that some of those proteins, which are toxic to certain insects or weeds, could possibly harm human health.
There's no conclusive evidence of harm and there's no conclusive evidence of safety, and in fact the FDA never has said these foods are safe. When there are questions about safety, it can only point to the market research, the industry research done by the very companies selling these products.
The seed in here, and these are soybeans.
Since the manufacturers of the genetically modified seeds also fund the toxicology studies, GMO skeptics question whether there's independently verifiable proof of safety.
I mean, are you surprised that there hasn't been a conclusive scientific study that says GMOs are bad for people?
I am. But I don't think there's an impetus for them to really test it. I don't think they want to test it.
And yet, sales of genetically modified seeds are a multi-billion-dollar business and growing. Each year, more and more farms are planting genetically modified crops. According to an organization which tracks what farmers are growing around the world, 27 countries planted genetically engineered crops in 2013, most of them developing countries. Fedorov says the science has the potential to address hunger across the globe.
So what is the contribution to feeding the world? You can reduce waste, you can reduce losses to insects and plants, and you can increase productivity.
If this were not Roundup Ready corn, or if this were not genetically modified corn, what would we see here?
You'd probably have a whole lot more weed pressure.
A majority of American farmland is farmed using genetically engineered crops and kept weed and insect free with synthetic chemicals. But 2/5 of American farmland is also planted with non-GMO crops, which are treated with synthetic chemicals. Only organic foods are both GMO and synthetic chemical free. Choosing to grow organic often demands more labor and cost to battle weeds and pests. What's attractive to farmers about genetically engineered crops is yield. For example, on this farm, Jenny Schmidt says she can get 36 bushels to the acre when she plants organic corn. She says she can get 6 times that when she plants genetically engineered corn.
We're choosing what seeds we want to buy, and we're choosing biotechnology for a reason, and that's because it works.
But in 1997, the European Union began requiring labeling of genetically modified foods. The Center for Food Safety now counts 64 nations with some type of labeling requirement. The United States is not among them. In the United States, some 25 states have put mandatory GMO labeling on the ballot. Only 3 states have passed such measures.
You won't see it mentioned in the supermarket aisle. It's hiding in the boxes where the GMOs are piled. You've got a right to know.
I've been calling with the SN 522, the campaign to label GMOs in Washington.
CCTV was in Washington State in November 2013 when voters cast ballots on whether to label GMO foods.
And I'm sure that there are some in this aisle that are genetically engineered, but we don't really know. I'd like to go.
Trudy Bialik wrote the initiative.
I think that's a good example. Companies need to label what they're already selling us.
I mean, the facts are really clear, and that's what our campaign's been focused on, really making sure consumers know what's in Initiative 522, because
Dana Bieber, a mother of 3, opposes the idea.
you know, food producers aren't going to want to put a warning label on the front of their product. It's about brand integrity. And so to avoid having to place that warning label on the food, they'd have to remake the food using higher priced non-GE ingredients.
Back on the Schmidt farm, Jenny says labeling would also make her produce more expensive, a cost she'd have to pass on to consumers.
So if labeling was passed, you would have to potentially quintuple your investment in
and that would
storage.
be true across the board for all farmers and end users.
In the end, Washington state voters chose not to mandate GMO labeling statewide. Around the world, nations, governments, and citizens are wrestling over the safety of genetically modified foods, even though the majority of scientific studies show they are safe. In Mexico, a group of farmers are suing the government to keep GMO corn out. In Germany, legislators tried to pass more labeling restrictions at a time when the EU is trying to loosen the labeling law. And in China, where labeling for genetically modified foods is the law, researchers are trying to perfect golden rice, a vitamin D-infused rice that could prevent blindness. They worry about anti-GMO sentiments blocking their efforts.
2 of our GM rice varieties have already been granted safety certificates by the Ministry of Agriculture in 2009. The certificates were granted only after rigorous testing.
We're actually just finishing up this, our GE seed, and today.
Back on the Schmidt's farm, Hans Schmidt is preparing to plant a new crop of soybeans. This time, they won't be genetically modified. Farmers, he reminds me, will always meet the demands of the market, so they can meet the needs of shoppers on both sides of the debate.
America's Now.